Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final installment of the Managing in Times of Change and Transition webinar series. I'm Vanessa Laurel with Capacity for Health, and I will be the facilitator for today's session. We have a few housekeeping items before we begin. Participants are currently on mute. If you have not done so, please go ahead and enter your access code and PIN so that you can hear us and fully participate in today's webinar. When you dialed the conference call number, you were prompted to enter your access code. After that, the system then prompts you to enable audio controls by entering your PIN. You will find the audio PIN in the audio section of the GoToWebinar control panel. During the discussion section at the end of the presentation, please raise your hand and I will unmute your line. You must enter your access code and audio PIN in order for me to do this. And if you prefer, you can also use the question/chat feature instead. Please note that this webinar will be audio recorded and published on our website at www.capacityforhealth.org. This webinar is hosted by Capacity for Health, a project of API-AHF with offices in San Francisco and Washington, D.C. We are currently funded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to provide free resources, trainings, webinars, and one-on-one tailored capacity building assistance in three main areas that you see on your screen. Today's webinar falls under the Organizational Infrastructure and Program Sustainability content area. We also do work in the other categories such as evidence-based interventions and public health strategies and monitoring and evaluation. We are very pleased and excited to have Doris Roach join us today and present on the topic of leading change. Doris, will you please go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And let's see, first let me see if I can get my slides up here. There we go, and I think everybody can see my slides. Vanessa, are we all set there?
Yes, we are.
Okay, awesome. All right, so this is a third of a three-part webinar series on managing in times of change and transition. And the focus today is on the leading part of managing. And as many of you know, many AIDS organizations have been experiencing significant changes in the field, from the economic downturn that's impacted funding to policy changes with the Center for Disease Control emphasizing more of a need for program collaboration and service integration. So as a result, a lot of traditionally AIDS service organizations are now looking at their mission and their vision, trying to see if there are areas that they might want to consider expanding beyond the HIV/AIDS arena. And then on the political front, we're all waiting to find out what the impact is going to be regarding the 2010 White House National Strategy on AIDS and HIV. And in particular, one aspect of the strategy is looking at focusing the emphasis on the prevention and care efforts at the state and local level, and an emphasis on community level impact, which is resulting in many organizations kind of looking at the current things that they're doing and coming up with new creative ways and strategies in order to increase the effectiveness of the good work that's already been done. Before we move on, what I'd like to do is get a sense of who out there is considering an expansion beyond HIV and AIDS work. So we have a polling question coming up, and that is, are you indeed considering expansion? Are you working on that now? Or is this something that you're not looking at? Or maybe you're considering looking at? And so while that polling question is being put on the screen, just beginning to look at what are the issues that you're considering beyond HIV/AIDS. So I don't see the polling question up. Vanessa, has that come up yet?
It is up.
Yeah, for some reason I'm not seeing it on my screen.
That's unfortunate. I'll be closing it in about 15 seconds, so if there are any further people who want to participate in the poll, please go ahead and do so.
All right. Okay, so while we're waiting for that, polling question to come up, one of the other areas of transition that bears mentioning is the fact that there's also a leadership transition trend that's occurring in nonprofit arenas. And that is a lot of baby boomers are getting ready to retire after holding their positions for 20 years or more, even though some are holding on to their positions a little bit longer given the economic downturn that's occurred. There is a leadership vacuum that's starting to emerge. And that leadership vacuum, behind the leadership vacuum are the Generation Yers and the Xers that are the next pool of leadership, but that pool is much smaller. And so as a result, part of managing in times of change and transition needs to take into consideration this leadership transition, and part of that leadership transition trend is a real strong need for nonprofits and people in AIDS and HIV to begin looking at who are those next leaders and doing some succession planning. And what I've seen in my work is that that's an area that tends to fall short.
So Doris, we have, yes, the poll has been closed. I'm guessing you haven't seen the results. We have 100% saying yes, that they are considering expanding beyond the original.
On my end, I'm not seeing the slides at all. Let's see, and I'm not seeing yours. I'm sorry, we're having just a bit of a technical issue here. All right, can you, there we go.
I see your slides.
Awesome, great, so we're on the right track. So 100% of you are considering expansion, so this whole topic of leading change is a significant one for you to be thinking about. In the prior two webinars, we talked about managing change on the individual level. We talked about managing change, managing teams through change. And as indicated, today's webinar is going to be focusing on leading change, and which is an important issue because as a leader of the organization, you're at the forefront of initiating the change. You're the one that announces that this needs to take place. And in order for the change of whatever process that is, whether you're considering expansion of your services, you might be considering a merger, there might be a leadership change, you've got to have support from not only your staff, but from your board and key stakeholders. So managing change is not enough. It has to be led. So as a result, in today's session, we're going to be covering 3 key issues regarding leading change. First, we're going to look at some key models that discuss and describe the change process. We're going to look at the importance of how you manage yourself as leader and the importance of having emotional intelligence along with your intellectual intelligence as you're managing any change effort. And then last but not least, as I indicated, because there is this leadership vacuum that's beginning to occur, the importance of succession planning, which is a class in and of itself, but bears mentioning with this topic matter.
Doris, so I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think your slides are frozen. They're not moving.
Oh, okay. We're having some significant technical difficulties here. Are they moving now? Can you see them?
No, it's still stuck on the polling question portion.
Okay, let me, let's do this. I'm going to, sorry folks. Okay, is it up now? And let me play.
Yes, now it's in today's session. We will cover.
Awesome.
Yes, that's
okay, so now we're catching up here. Okay, so, all right. So now what we're going to do is I have a second polling question for you. And I want to get a sense of where you are in the leading change process. And that is, the question is, are you currently leading a change initiative? And so if you are, marking yes. If you're not, of course, no. Maybe you're considering managing a change process or the beginning stages of thinking about the next change process. Or it may be ongoing. A lot of organizations have a lot going on, and change is very much a part of the process, and in that instance, you would mark ongoing. So if everybody could let me know where you are in the change process. Okay, and I believe we're starting to close. Okay, So none of you are leading a change initiative, and that's fine. So you have some advanced knowledge in this webinar to get a sense of the kinds of things that you need to be thinking about as you're considering expanding your services beyond the HIV/AIDS arena, which a lot of you said that you are in the process of doing. So let's go back to the slides, and I want to make sure that the slides are shown.
I'm not seeing it just yet.
Yeah, let's see, I'm going to... It has on my screen that we're sharing the full results, okay? And now I believe the screen, awesome. Okay, so as I said, we're going to be looking at some change models. And what I want to talk about now is the fact that in order for change efforts to be effective, they have to be supported. And there we go. And in order to be supported, a leading change management guru, John Cotter, whose work I respect, says that there has to be 5 elements present. First, people have to relate to the vision. They have to feel as though the decision that's being made to change is something that they can buy into. And then second is the Witham factor. People need to feel as though there's something in it for them. What's in it for me? Some sort of personal gain, either that the organization is going to be able to successfully increase its capacity or is going in the right direction, and that by staying with the organization that they're going to benefit in some form or fashion. The other issue that needs to be addressed is people need to feel a sense of some sort of control, and that is input, that their voices and opinions are being heard as a result of the change effort, that they have some say in the decisions that are being made rather than having things being done to them as a way of providing some input and support. A very important factor that change gurus look at is that in order for people to support any change effort, they have to respect the leader. If people don't feel confident in the person or the board that is initiating the change, they are going to resist, and they can definitely sabotage efforts to move forward. And then last but not least, believing that the timing is correct. So given these challenges of implementing change on an organizational level, it's very important to have the full support of your staff, key members, of key stakeholders, and your board on board, and that's a pun intended, in order to be successful. So I'd like to talk now about a theory called discretionary effort that I just recently learned something about. And this theory of discretionary effort comes from the work of the Towers Perrin consulting organization that did a global workforce study. They surveyed and talked with over 90,000 workers in over 2,000 countries. And they were looking at what were the things that motivated people, that helped them step up to the plate, that made them put in a little bit more effort than they would normally do. And what they found was that on the lower level, the minimum amount of effort required for anyone to keep their jobs, pretty much doing what needs to be done but not much extra, is about 30%, which I was pretty astounded when I saw that percentage. It's pretty low. And then you have the high percenters, the high performers rather, and those are your star performers, the people that are delivering consistently across the board, consistently across the board. And those performers are providing or exerting effort about 80% of the time, and they're not doing 100% because if they were doing 100%, they would be burnout. So in between the top performers performing at 80% and the minimum amount of effort at 30% is this gap called discretionary effort. And so when they found that, they wanted to determine what contributed to people putting in a little bit more effort into this zone. And what they found was that the relationship that people had with their managers if they felt that their managers treated them well, respected them, they were more inclined to do a little bit more, go the extra mile. And so this has been pretty much the standard for quite a while until they started taking a deeper look at discretionary effort beyond just the managerial relationship level. And what they found was that an even greater key to having people step up to the plate even more was how people felt about their leadership. If they felt people on the leadership level really cared about them and understood what they were going through, went the extra mile for them, then employees were more inclined to put in more discretionary effort to move up more to the top performer level, which I think is a very important issue when you're talking about managing change and transition. Because when you're managing change and transition or leading change and transition, there are these two sides. There's the technical side where you're making strategic decisions about what policies you're going to implement, what changes you're going to implement, and all of the nuts and bolts that come into play when you're thinking about expanding beyond the current capacity of your organization. But then there's that human side of change, the people that actually have to implement the change, and that's where change efforts tend to fall short, and that's where this whole theory of discretionary effort becomes very important, and how you as leader are perceived and viewed by the workforce can have a significant impact on the success or the failure of any change effort. And one of the areas that needs to be addressed and looked at as leader is making sure that you have an understanding of, number one, what the impact of change effort, what happens during the change effort, and having some empathy for the wide range of reactions that you might encounter as a result of making a significant change. And in this instance, the majority of you are thinking about expanding beyond HIV/AIDS, which is going to really bring up a lot in terms of, this is what we've always done, are you sure we want to go in this direction? So it can bring up some sense of uncertainty as well as excitement about the possibilities. So given that, I'd like to now talk about the change process from a leadership perspective. And I want to call upon the work of William Bridges, which I talked more about in the past two webinars, but bears mentioning here. And William Bridges was someone who did a lot of work on looking at the impact of change. And what he says, it's not the changes that do you in, but the transitions. And so his work emphasizes on this three-part process that he describes as the endings, the neutral zones, and the new beginnings, and everything that happens in between as what you need to be paying attention to, where the real work begins in order to institutionalize any change or process that you're leading. Within that range, that change curve, are any number of reactions that might occur, and that's based on the work of Elizabeth Cooper-Ross, who did a lot of work on looking at the death and dying process and the changes that people went through as they accepted the fact that they were dying. And her work has now been integrated into the organizational development arena. And they found that the similar patterns of feeling first a sense of denial when you're encountering that something is going to be different, to finding a sense of acceptance when you finally get to that place of commitment to the new beginning. All those ranges of emotions occur on an organizational level. So from a leadership standpoint, having an understanding of what this transition process is about, when you initiate a change, when you first announce the fact that either as a result of looking at your mission and vision, it's decided that you really need to merge with another organization that can increase your capacity to do the work that you're doing. Or maybe there's a leadership change. The executive director, who has been the mascot of the organization, I'm going to use that terminology, maybe has been there for 20 years, a baby boomer decides it's time to retire. When you announce that ending, your staff, your board, your key stakeholders, your clients, are going to have a reaction. And that can span anywhere from a sense of denial, no, this is not happening, to feeling some real resistance. We don't want to go there. This is the way that we've always done things. So if you have an understanding of this as leader, then you can generate a sense of empathy. If people feel like you understand what they're going through, that has an impact on the level of effort that people are willing to exert, going back to the discretionary effort theory, to help you move through that transition process once you've decided to make a change. So when the change has been initiated, that ending has occurred, you're going to be moving from one state to the next. We're moving into stage 2, and that's the neutral zone stage. That's the stage where you're making an adjustment to the new reality. So if you decided to expand to a new service area, it's a matter of learning the new skills in order to work in that new area, having new collaborations, developing your capacity of your staff to deliver services in that new capacity, in that new area. And in this stage, this is a period where there can be some transition of feelings of confusion, feelings of impatience. Gosh, I wish, let's get on with it already. Let's move on to this next stage. Feelings of when will this ever end? And this is where William Bridges talks about this being the most juicy part of the transition process, but also one of the most difficult parts of transitioning, because here is where you're trying to institutionalize. You have to revisit the decisions that have been made, readjust, and as leaders, sometimes you can feel a sense of impatience because you want to just get it done from a technical standpoint, but there's that human element that requires some portion, some time to transition and adjust to the new state of being. So as leader, being aware that this process takes time, communicating that, and giving people assurance that you're willing to go the distance with them as they incorporate the change is very, very vital in leading any change effort. And last but not least, eventually when the change becomes more institutionalized, for using the example of maybe merging with another organization, the merger has been completed and the staff and the policies have been integrated, that heralds the beginning, the new beginning. And this is where people start to feel like, okay, I understand what the change is all about. I can see how this can be a positive thing. And there's more of a buy-in and a commitment in order to kind of land in this new place. And as leader, here is where you are in the position to be celebrating the hard work that's been done to get you to this new place, communicating the new state of being, helping to create the new story, helping to reinforce the new values and the new vision and the direction that the organization is going towards as a result of this change process. So before we begin to look a little bit more deeply at your role as leader and the role of emotional intelligence, I'd like to get a pulse, a sense of what stage of transition you might be currently leading. I know some of you were saying that you were considering expanding into a different service area. But are you in a ending phase at some point? Are you in the neutral zone where you're adjusting to a new state of being? Are you in a new beginning where the stage has become institutionalized and you're leading people through that new beginning? So it's just getting a sense of where are people in that process. And shortly that poll will be closing. So as leader, as we're waiting for those poll results to come in, having a clear understanding of where your organization is in terms of this change process and transition, not only about how people might be reacting, but also how you as leader might be reacting, and as well as how the kinds of things that you need to be paying attention to in order to move forward. So I see that the majority of you are in new beginnings. So you're institutionalizing the changes, and this is the place where you're celebrating those changes and also making sure that the changes that you have implemented continue to take hold and stay put. One of the things that I want to mention is that in the new beginnings phase, and this is something to be mindful of as leader, you know, as human beings, we like creature comforts, we like our habits and our patterns. So it's important during the new beginning phase to be very mindful that you keep up the momentum. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about organizational change process using John Cotter's model, because we can flip back to our old habits. And so it's important as you're celebrating, also reinforcing what needs to continue to occur in order for that new beginning to take hold. All right, so now what I'd like to do is talk about emotionally intelligent leadership. And this is based on the work of Daniel Goleman, who wrote the seminal book, Emotional Intelligence, and pretty much made mainstream this concept of emotional intelligence, and since has gone on to write several follow-up books about the fact that it's not just the intellectual intelligence, what you know, but it's also how you manage yourself and how you manage your relationships, your emotional intelligence or EQ, that can have far more impact on the quality of leadership and how it's experienced rather than what you know as you're managing change. So as he looked at this EQ concept from a leadership perspective in managing change and transition, he identified several different leadership styles that should be taken into consideration, or may be taken into consideration rather, when you're navigating this change curve and that transition from the endings to the neutral zone and the new beginnings. And he identified those as coercive, authoritative, affiliative, democratic, case setting, and coaching. So let's look at these leadership styles and how they tie into emotional intelligence and where they might potentially be applied during the various phases of transition. So the first emotionally intelligent leadership styles is during the ending phase. And this is that phase that we just described, where you've made the announcement that you're making a change, and people can have varying reactions from denial to resistance being very much a part of the process. And in this stage, he says that from a leadership perspective, this is really where you have to step very squarely into the leadership, the shoes of leadership. This is where the style of being very, very clear about the direction that the organization is going, clear about the vision, the reason why we're doing this is going to expand our capacity and our viability, as well as present some new opportunities for growth. So as an authoritative leader, it means that you are confident in the direction that you're going, and you're exuding that confidence to your staff, to your stakeholders, to all the people that are going to be affected by this change. And from an emotional intelligence standpoint, this requires having empathy for the varying reactions. It also requires having strong interpersonal skills, which is an emotionally intelligent skill. It also requires having a foresight and vision about how what's happening is going to affect the varying relationships within your organization. So really stepping into your power as leader and exerting the authority of clear confidence in the direction that you're going, but also managing yourself, and this is the emotional intelligence of self-awareness, so that I'm going to say, don't go overboard and become a dictator, but managing yourself in the sense that you're exuding confidence so that people can feel confident and you're providing them with an anchor so that they know that the leader is on board, everyone, and then we can follow you. The second type of leadership that can be used during the ending phase is what he calls coercive. And when I first saw that terminology, I thought, wow, that sounds very negative and authoritative as well. But what he means by coercive, this is the my way or the highway kind of style of leadership. What he says is that it can be very appropriate in times of crisis. So if you have an organization that is facing a major funding cut, 50% of your funding is going out the door, and I'm not being facetious saying that. I've worked with someone who is actually facing that crisis. this is a time when you have to really be very directive and authoritative and make the tough decisions about what needs to be cut, the layoffs that needs to be implemented in order to keep the organization afloat and alive. So the cohesiveness is my way or the highway in service to the organization, but in a way that where the buck stops with you, where you're making the tough decisions. Where the emotional intelligence information comes into play is, again, self-awareness. Being mindful that you're not moving into dictatorship or having that coercive leadership style well beyond the time the crisis has passed. Being what I call drunk with power. Wow, I'm able to make these tough decisions, but then not being mindful of the impact of you as leader and the decisions that you're making on your staff and your key stakeholders, and getting to a place where morale is starting to be impacted, or and you start losing support of the key stakeholders. So the emotional intelligence of self-awareness, empathy, and the interpersonal skills come into play with these styles of emotional intelligence during the ending phase. As we move into stage 2, this is the neutral zone. This is where the confusion can occur, a sense of adjustment as you're beginning to institutionalize whatever direction you've decided to go with the organization. And if you're looking at expanding your service area and you've made a decision about where you want to go, here is where it's important that the styles of affiliative, democratic, and coaching styles, leadership styles come into play. When we talk about affiliative style, we're talking about the ability to bring the right players together to have the right conversations in order to make the changes occur. And when you're utilizing this style, there is almost a stepping back and facilitating the interpersonal relationships that are going to effectively allow you to realize that vision that has been implemented as a result of the ending. The democratic style is about utilizing skills of consensus building. This is where you're creating opportunities for dialogue to occur and input to be gotten from your staff, from your board, from maybe clients that you're serving, giving feedback about how well the changes that you're making are how well they're going, how effective are they, the kinds of shifts and changes that you need to make as a result of having made this change, so that you make sure that you're on the right track. And some of that might involve coaching, which is much more of a less directive approach that you might take in the ending phase, and more of a collaborative, let's see what you're thinking to help inform the decisions that need to be made. And so you're not as hands-on, but you're helping to guide the process through a supportive effort. When you're talking about implementing these leadership styles from an emotionally intelligent standpoint, it's really important that you have a sense of empathy again, that your interpersonal relationship skills are effective because you're bringing people together, being able to identify how people are feeling in the moment so that you can help guide and support the direction of the conversations that are taking place. And the democratic style might even entail a sense of social responsibility, which would include the possibility that some of the decisions that are being made might not potentially benefit you as leader, and being willing to take that back seat in service to the change effort and in service to that new vision that is occurring. So last but not least is the stage of new beginnings, and here is where this is requiring the leadership style of pace setting, according to Daniel Goldman. Here is where you have to keep up the momentum. And in order to keep up the momentum, people are looking to you as leader to walk the talk, to continuously reinforce the vision, to keep the communication channels open, to keep people informed about how things are progressing, including celebrating those new beginnings. And the majority of you are in a new beginning phase, so this is something to pay particularly attention to. The pace-setting leadership style can be challenging in the sense that as you're setting the pace, as you're walking the talk, as you're demonstrating the new behaviors, to be mindful of, from an emotional intelligence standpoint, that people may not be keeping up with you. So having some empathy about, okay, this is what's happening. Are people able to keep up with me? Are the standards that I set reasonable standards? And this is because you want to make sure that the pace that you're setting is going to support increased morale, because people need to feel a sense of success. So being mindful of the pace that you're setting and the impact of that pace and how it's affecting people around you. And again, the affiliative leadership style of bringing people together to continuously support the change that has been implemented so that it becomes a very solid part of your institution, of your agency structure. So I have another polling question that I'd like to ask before we move on. And I'd like to just get a sense of how are you doing with your change initiatives. The majority of you are in new beginnings. And I'd like to get a sense of, are you feeling a sense of accomplishment, that the change is going very well? Or is it up and down, which is also part of the process? That's one reaction. Or maybe not so great. You've made a new change, but there's still a lot of resistance, and there's still a lot of adjustment that's being made, even though the change has been implemented. Or you're not sure. You know, some days it's good, some days it's not so great. So just trying to get a sense of where are you in the polling process. And we'll be getting that those results in just a moment. So as we're waiting for those results, okay, so a lot of you are up and down, and that makes total sense. And I'm glad that that we had that reaction, because change is, as we go back to the change curve, is not a straight line. We're dealing with the human effort, with the human element. Some people like change, a lot of people don't. And especially depending on the nature of change, especially if it's one that's been a difficult one where you've been impacted by a significant funding cut, or there's been a leadership change, it does sometimes take time for that change effort to come into play. So as we move into the next area of this presentation, maybe you'll get some clues about what might need to happen in order to support a more smooth change process. So now what we're going to do is look at an 8-step change process model. And this is one that was developed by John Cotter, who is a leading change guru, an internationally known change guru, who used to be a Harvard business law professor, not law, Harvard business professor, and started to look at the nature of change and large-scale change, and what were the things that helped help make change successful, and what were the things that made change not so successful. And so one of the things that he said is that you have to get 75%, which I think is an astounding number, of your management, of your board, of your key stakeholders. You've got to get 75% of your constituency on board with the change in order for that change to happen, in addition to paying attention to the human elements of change. And so what he found that there were 8 steps that were needed for a successful change process. The first was creating a sense of urgency. The second was forming a powerful coalition. The third was having a vision and communicating that vision often. The fifth was making sure that you removed obstacles along the way. The sixth was making sure that you celebrated your successes along the way and not all at once. 7, building upon the change. And 8, making sure that you anchor the change. So let's look at each one of these steps. The first is creating a sense of urgency, and I think that his take on this is really important, especially as nonprofits. In my work, in the nature of the work itself, we tend to be very reactionary. We're putting out fires, and we're dealing with things as they occur. So what he says is that when you're implementing a change process, there has to be a sense of true urgency versus false urgency. And I thought this was brilliant. He said that with false urgency, what you're doing is you're just reacting to the change. So that false sense of urgency is that, okay, you've got a 50% funding cut coming down the line, and you've got to react to it. That's not a true sense of urgency, because then it becomes making change because you're in fear, and there's a high sense of, yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but your slides are frozen again.
Oh, they are. Okay. Yes. All right. There they are?
Yes.
They should be showing up. Excellent. Okay. So we're all caught up there. So he says that the false sense of urgency is the reaction. You get the news, you have to make a change, and you've decided to go in a different direction because there's some external force that's forcing you to do that. With a true sense of urgency, that is, yes, you've received this information, but what are the opportunities here for the organization to grow? Maybe we might have a 50% funding cut coming down the line, but maybe this might provide us with an opportunity to grow in a direction that we might not have otherwise grown had this not occurred. And I had a real-life example of this with an organization that I was working with to do some, I was brought in to do some strategic planning where they were facing a 50% funding cut. And this was an organization that was doing extraordinary work, but what they discovered was nobody knew how well they were doing, and they had to deal with the fact that they might have to shut their doors. And in fact, there was some tension between board members, some of which said, let's shut our doors, and the others were saying, no, we got to keep going. So what the executive director did, which I thought was just brilliant, was to say, look, here's an opportunity. Yes, we have an urgency. We have to look at other funding streams, but let's take a closer look at what we do well and how can we capitalize on it. And so she was able to create a true sense of urgency, which got people mobilized in a positive, proactive way in the face of this very significant threat, and had some honest discussions about what needed to happen, what they needed to move out of in order to be able to survive. But not only survive, but thrive. And that's the message here, creating that true sense of urgency, how you can thrive. So the next step is, I'm trying to change here, is forming a powerful coalition. So once you've identified the true sense of urgency rather than just a reactive mode, then you've got to bring together the leaders of your organization. And what I like about this particular step and his take on this is that your leaders are not just your traditional leaders like the CFO and the executive director or the board chair. These are leaders throughout your organization that people depend on and respect, from that program manager who really knows their stuff and is very, very good at what they do. You're going to want this person on your team in order to guide the decision-making that needs to be made in order to initiate the change, to that administrative assistant who is just a technical pro and that is the go-to person who can help you think through the systems changes that need to be implemented. So those individuals throughout the organization, or maybe even a client who you've had regular contact with, who really has a pulse of what's going on in the community, you may want to have them sitting on that coalition as you're making decisions about where to go next. So forming that powerful coalition, making sure it's a good mix, and making sure that that team is built up well so that to support that change effort. Then he says that you have to have a vision. Where is it that you want to go? So going back to that example of that organization that was facing that 50% funding cut, and the executive director that had the foresight to say, what are the opportunities here? The vision then became for them, we want to become a nationally known organization, which was not something that they were focused on before. That was the vision. And that was a vision that people could buy into. That was something that they can move towards as a possibility because they had this expertise that they knew internally they had, but no one else knew about it. So there was that vision to become nationally known. And so when he says when you create that vision, it's a simple one. It's one that some people can grasp and understand quickly, that can be articulated by the members of your coalition, your staff, your board, and easily and often. And it's part of your execution strategy for whatever change initiative that you want to make. So you've got to communicate that vision. You've got to communicate it often as that fourth step. And leading by example is absolutely key. So you as leader saying over and over again, we are moving toward national recognition of the work that we do is part of this change process. The next step, he says, is that you've got to remove the obstacles. And, you know, this is common sense, but it's very important what he says is that as you're initiating any change effort, you're doing that analysis. What's working? What's not? What's your organizational structure like? Do you need to make some shifts and changes? And in the process of doing that, recognizing and rewarding people who are making the kinds of changes that need to be made in order to make move the organization forward. So going back to that example of that organization that was facing the 50% funding cut, one of the processes that we underwent with the strategic planning process was looking at the structure and recognizing that the way that they were organized wasn't fully utilizing the full capacity of the staff that they had on board. So they began to make some decisions about some shifts and changes that could strengthen the organization in order to help them begin that road towards the national recognition that they were seeking as part of their vision. Then he says you need to create short-term wins, and that is you need to celebrate all your milestones as you've made a change. Make it known. We've accomplished this objective. We're meeting these particular goals. If you're implementing a new service area, we've been able to reach so many people as a result of using this new technique. And this is a way of helping to keep people motivated because, as you know, any change effort is a marathon. And I used to live in Boston and watch the marathon, and I watched them at the 15th mile. And let me tell you, even the strongest, most fit person looks absolutely haggard by that time because it is a long process, and having to face, celebrate each milestone is really important. So going back to the marathon, having people there, and I've been told by people who have actually participated in marathons, to cheer them on at that 15th mile, and I'd be out there really yelling and screaming because I was so proud of these people, but it really helped to keep people, keep that momentum going when they had, like 20 more miles to go. So it's the same thing with any organization change initiative, is making sure that you're creating those short-term wins as a way of keeping people motivated and keeping them going for the long run. Then building upon the change, and this is after every win, analyzing what went well, what didn't go well, what needs to be shifted and changed. And that means not adhering to your agenda, but being flexible enough around the kinds of shifts and changes that need to be made in order for the change process to take hold, and also to invite some new, fresh ideas to keep the momentum going. And then last but not least, it's the anchoring, and he says that this can be the most challenging aspect of any change, and a lot of you are in that new beginning phase. Many of you have said it's up and down, and here is where the real work occurs. Here is where you as leader are setting the pace, continuously reinforcing, communicating about the new way of being, the new expectations, rewarding people for following those expectations as a way of creating that new story of how the organization is now and the positive effects of the changes that have been made. And that includes publicly recognizing extraordinary efforts and the efforts of everyone who's participated in that change effort. Okay, so now that we've looked at emotionally, the change process and the changes that people go through and the things that you need to be mindful of as leader. The different kinds of leadership styles that can be implemented during the various phases of change, from endings, neutral zones, to new beginnings. And then looking at this eight-step change process, I'd like to now briefly touch upon succession planning, and going back to that point that I made earlier about the fact that we are facing, I'm going to say, and I think some leading experts are saying, a potential crisis of leadership in the nonprofit arena. We do have this massive exit of baby boomers who have held those leadership thrones for quite a while, 20 years or more. And we have a new batch of leaderships that need to be groomed to take over the helm, the Generation Xers and Yers, and that's a much smaller pool. So here is where, when you're talking about managing in times of change and transition, you need to be mindful of who are your potential future leaders within the organization, and grooming them to be able to take the helm in the event that there's an emergency. So I'm going to go back to that example that I used earlier about that organization facing 50% funding cut. During the process of our doing the strategic change, our management process, our planning process rather, the executive director, who was really the cornerstone of that organization, had to leave the organization for health reasons. And it was had quite a significant impact. We had to really do some scrambling around who was going to step up to the plate in this person's absence. Thank goodness it was only a temporary exit, but it really got the organization thinking about, wow, you know, we've been talking a lot about succession planning, but what would we do if a key person left the organization, and what's our backup plan? So this is an area that I think we give a lot of lip service to, we think a lot about, but because there's so much on our plates, there's so much to be dealt with, and we are dealing with an era where there is so much change happening with the economic changes and the political changes and the policy changes, this can sometimes take a back seat and is actually something that should be much more to the forefront. So when you talk about succession planning, it allows you to react effectively to emergencies. So it's really good risk planning. It's also a way of making sure that you retain key knowledge, expertise, and relationships. And these are your organizational assets. So identifying who holds those jewels and making sure that you have a backup plan in case that person goes. I mean, we've all experienced situations where our computers have crashed, and it's a crisis because all of our information goes. Well, it's the same thing with the human element, which begs the case for succession planning. It's also an opportunity here to provide employees with an opportunity for professional development. And one of the tensions that I've seen in nonprofits is the fact that sometimes leaders hold on to their positions a little bit too long, and those beneath them, the potential leaders that are coming up, kind of feel hemmed in, and you might lose some of that talent so that they go elsewhere in order to be able to shine and show their leadership skills. So if you're undergoing a succession planning effort, taking the time to identify those potential people, develop them, groom them, show them the way, is also a motivating factor. And going back to the discretionary effort theory, if you have people that are being supported and developed, that's going to encourage them to produce more. So when we look at succession planning, it's a 360-degree effort. It's looking at strategic planning. It's looking at job descriptions, maybe cross-training, and also how you're going to be communicating the change effort. The succession plan effort. So some key questions to consider, and again, we don't have time to go into each in-depth into succession planning, but some questions to think about is, how are the changes that are happening externally going to impact or change the needs of leadership? what positions, and I mean beyond just the executive director, that if that person left, that program manager, or even that executive assistant left, you know, if they left, how would that create a significant vacuum? And what's the backup plan for them? What's your action plan? Have you looked at the gap analysis? Have you examined what capacity your staff is at, and what some additional training do they need in order to close that gap? And how will you implement that succession planning? How will you communicate the succession plan in order to get buy-in? How will you recruit? How will you restructure? I'm beginning to look at some of those questions. And then, again, follow-up. How are you going to monitor, evaluate, and update that succession plan? There is a free tool on the Internet, which I'll share with you in just a moment. It was a guide to succession planning that was completed by Compass Point, and I've provided you with the link, and it's well worth looking at. It provides a step-by-step process of how to deal with succession planning. So as we're coming to the end of the webinar, I came across this wonderful article called A Survival Guide for Change Leaders. It was written by Ronald Heathus and Marty Liginsky. And what they said was, if you're leading a change effort, it's also important for you as leader to take care of yourself. And they give these 8 pointers, which with a little bit of a humorous take, but in all seriousness. So first they say that you got to get off the dance floor, and go to the balcony. And what they mean by this is, when you're undergoing a change effort, you tend to be right in the fray. You're making decisions. You're reacting in the moment. And it's important to step back and look at things from a bird's eye view. Distance yourself a little bit so you can have a better understanding of how the change effort is working, who it's impacting, and what kinds of changes and shifts need to be implemented in order for the change effort to be successful. They also say it's important to keep your friends close, those supporters, those colleagues, those mentors, those people that you can go to that will tell you the truth. I often hear from the people that I do executive coaching with, it's lonely at the top. You can't share with your staff and your board the challenges or worries or concerns that you might be having around the decisions that have to be made. So having that close support circle is important for any change effort. And then they also say, keep your enemies closer. Those people that are not necessarily on board. So going back to that example of that organization facing a 50% funding cut, that executive director made sure she kept the lines of communication open with those board members that were not on board, and that's the pun intended, and wanted to find out what their concerns, what they were thinking, so that she could effectively strategize to make sure that her vision was realized. And those people that are not on board and are not necessarily clear about where they're going, if they're board members, they have votes. So you need to make sure that you're talking with those people that aren't sure, giving them the information that they need to have to support them, to make sure that, you know, when it comes down to voting on a direction, that they're going to be on your side. They also say cook the conflict, and that means making sure that there's an honest dialogue, that people talk about what's going on, to encourage differences of opinion, but in a respectful and proactive way, the way of ensuring ongoing commitment. And then they say, place the work where it belongs. You know, as leaders, we tend to want to do everything ourselves. We have a team, making sure that if responsibilities have been assigned, that people are stepping up to the plate and are held accountable. That's part of leadership. Managing your hungers is about managing yourself. Going back to that emotional intelligence leadership, you know, having a self-awareness. How are you being impacted? How are you reacting? You know, are you using appropriate leadership styles depending on the stage that you're in? And making sure that you're anchored, that you have support for yourself, making time for your family and friends if that's something that's important to you. Making sure that you get exercise, those self-care things, because I often say to my leaders, if your well is empty, there's nothing to draw upon, and people are looking to you to lead that change effort. So last but not least, I want to share with you some resources for your toolkit, and I think I'm right on time, Vanessa, which is great. There's a great there's a great book by Dan Cohen, who has worked very closely with Don Cotter, called the Heart of Change Field Guide. And the guide is great because it gives you very specific tools and tactics that you can implement for each stage of the change effort. So that's worth having on your library shelf. It may be worth going back and looking at John Cotter's Leading Change, Why Transformation Efforts Fail. That's the classic article that launched his eight-step change effort process, and it's very well worth reading. These are things that you can get online. A couple of other business review articles that are important for you to maybe check out, including the Survival Guide, is Leading in Times of Change. That provides some very good tips for leaders going through the change effort. And then the Survival Guide, and then last but not least is that Succession Planning free guide that was written by Tim Wolfram for Compass Point. And I've provided you with the link. You can download it. It gives some very good tips and tools if you're thinking about succession planning, which I'm encouraging you to do. So we have come to the end of the presentation, and I'd like to open it up to questions. And we also have time following the presentation to answer any additional questions. I'll be online for an additional 15 minutes. So are there any questions?
And at this moment, I will ask participants to please raise your hand if you have a question, if you would like to speak directly to Doris, or you may also use the questions or chat feature on the GoToWebinar control panel. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them.
So any questions? There's a lot of information given in a very short period of time. I'm sure there's some questions out there. I also want to invite you, if you have any questions following the webinar, I'll be providing you with my email address. I'm very happy to respond to any questions offline if you want to talk about any aspect of what's been presented to you here today in more detail. So any questions, Vanessa?
No, we haven't received any.
Okay, so I know that the PowerPoint slides are going to be provided, and again, I want to emphasize the fact that I will be available. I can be reached at doris@dorisroach.com if you have additional questions. Happy to answer them. Thank you very much for being here today and participating. This ends the three-part webinar series, and I hope that you found the information helpful.
And at this moment, I'm actually going to go ahead and close things out. And so if you bear with me a quick second. So once again, as Doris mentioned, the slides, resources, and a recorded version of this webinar will be available on our Capacity for Health website at www.capacityforhealth.org. You can also find and register for any of our upcoming webinars and trainings by going to our upcoming trainings and webinars page on our website. Of course, feel free to contact us for any of your capacity building assistance needs, and you can contact us via phone or email as you see on the screen. One of the other ways that you can stay in touch with us is by signing up for our mailing list. And as I mentioned previously, we are funded by CDC to provide free capacity building assistance in a number of different areas. Thank you very much for your participation in today's webinar. And as Doris mentioned before, she will be staying on for another 15 minutes to answer any additional questions you might have. Thank you and have a wonderful day.